In an effort to keep working parents, some employers are building their own daycare. All right, so the lead into this article written by Kristen Parisi is over half of U.S. parents who pay for childcare estimate that they'll spend at least 20% of their salary on daycare this year.
Mhm.
And so Summer and I are going to unpack some of the things that you can read about in the article. And these are just some things that employers are doing to help with childcare. And, I'm interested. I have kids. And if you don't have kids, you're likely working or leading someone who does. So uh, this segment, I'll just start it off with, what stood out the most to you, Summer?
Well, similar to you, Joey, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I think about while my children are a bit older now, they're in their teens. It wasn't that long ago that there were a lot of very difficult decisions that had to be made in regards to time and finances as it relates to having school age children. And so, for our listeners that do have school age children, I think they can relate to these challenges of trying to be a working parent and managing childcare. Some of the notable items in this article were some of the stats. You mentioned one of them, but I'll also cover a few more. First, there's 63 million parents, working parents with children under the age of 18. And of that, 10 million are single parents. Now, let's just stop there and think about it. Of those numbers, thinking about what portion of the workforce is trying to balance all of these priorities to me was really staggering. And, with over half of the US working parents spending at least 20% of their salary on childcare, I think that's a very conservative number. It does say at least, but, Joey, I remember really early in my career, I had children when I was in my 20s. And, I was earlier in my career not making a lot of money. And I remember actually having to decide, should I quit my job? Because the expense for two kids in childcare at that time was almost my entire take home pay. So I'm sure that you've had conversations with other individuals where they're faced with those same struggles as well. And for some, they have options. For others, um, they may be forced to kind of look at their situation and say, I have no choice but to quit my job because the expense and or the challenges outweigh what some of the benefits are for them.
Yeah, this fact that you mentioned about comparing your take home pay to what you're paying out in childcare, and of course, childcare isn't just the confines of like what you're doing while you're working. It's also all of the payments that you have to do, like the diapers, the food, the transportation, the camps, the activities, all those things. And unfortunately, I think, now looking back these past 3 or 4 years has been a terrible stretch for parents because not only are we having to battle with the increase in the cost of childcare, but also there's the safety component with COVID being a very real thing. And now, what we'll talk about later, monkeypox, that being a real thing. So, it's taxing on a parent to say, well, even if I can't afford it, do I want to risk my child being somewhere where they may not be protected, or they may have to spend more expenses to keep them protected? And unfortunately, a lot of economists, thought leaders, statisticians in this HR and labor space have looked at childcare and some of those unpaid labor costs at home as one of the big drivers for why a lot of women disappeared from the workforce over this last COVID pandemic. So I think with this article, it's really good for employers to take a look at what they're doing to help parents because secretly they're struggling. And it's no big secret because we all know that raising kids is expensive and with inflation it's getting more expensive. So I think that, the past 3 years there's been that big focus on mental health. And now I hope as we transition into this next, I guess, 3 year sprint, there's a focus on parents and how to make sure that their home lives are taken care of, childcare is taken care of, and that companies will have features and benefits to help make that a reality. Uh, did anything I say make sense, Summer? Do you want to share your thoughts?
I'd love to. And I think that's a great lead in to talking a little bit about why this article caught our attention, but also expand on it because I think the article was well written and it's definitely bringing attention to a very important matter for, clearly based on the stats, a large segment of the workforce. And, the article does touch a little bit on, what's driving some employers to build their own daycares. And it is, really truly that mix of challenges that you mentioned. Everything's going up and the balance is just becoming difficult. People are burning out. And if they didn't already leave the workforce as the result of COVID in itself, now there's additional factors. And so companies are saying like, hey, what can we do to try to combat this? And some large companies, such as Home Depot, Patagonia, Cisco, some of these mega employers are, working with budgets to where they're able to build their own daycares. But now there are actually other employers that are trying to find ways to do this as well. And so I wanted to talk about not just that, but what some of the alternatives could also be for various companies to try to help with just this problem as a whole.
Let's do it because I mean, here at Jumpstart, we're all remote. We're not building a daycare center, right? So, what are some of the things that teams like us who are remote or small or don't have the big budgets like the Fortune 500s, what can they do to bring some relief to parents and use it as a retention strategy?
Wait, you said we aren't building a daycare center? You must have missed that meeting, Joey, that we had that said, since we have a lot of employees in the greater Maryland area, and that since Joey has small children and also a nanny, that we were just going to start it at your house.
See, what happens when goes on vacation, you miss meetings and now you gotta uh follow through with the team decisions. All right, so what are some of the things that that businesses can do, if small businesses, mid-size, what can they do? What are you seeing where there can be some relief to working parents?
One of the options that's moderately expensive would be a childcare stipend. And so these can be direct payments that come to the employees based on any amount that the company chooses. Or another idea is actually the company subsidizing some of the childcare with specific childcare centers. So I seem to recall, again, when my kids were in preschool, that there were a couple centers near where the main headquarters that I worked for was located. And they had negotiated discounts for our employees. And then that employer would also offer a small subsidy. So there was a real incentive for employees to utilize that center, both in proximity, discount, and subsidy. So that's one option. And some of the expenses that companies may plan for in terms of amount is, if you were to do something like this, the spend is approximately $10,000 per employee per year. Definitely not cheap, but if you think about, if you have some very high performing employees or teams within your organization, not all of them are going to need this, but if you could afford $10,000 to keep them, one, in the workforce, and two, within your company, that could be money, definitely well spent.
Yeah, not only well spent, well invested, because I think about being a parent, and if I know that my employer is contributing to the peace of mind of my kids, that gives me peace of mind. I'll likely be more productive, and I'll likely, have less call offs or less days, kind of being, present at work but not mentally there because something's going on. So it really is an investment. The other thing I think too is when you think about that $10,000 number, and there's also the dependent care FSAs, which is a whole nother thing that's more structured and has tax benefits. You're not paying that all at once, and so it's a incremental thing that you'd be able to do. So I see it as an investment, a strategic investment in securing great talent and attracting great talent too. It's something that can go on a job description.
I love that you refer to it as an investment because I do think that that's the right way to approach it when you think about the mindset and the value that spending this type of money from a business standpoint really should be viewed. We talked a little bit about the on-site childcare being being an option, and I wanted to also clarify on this that while there are some large companies doing this, it's not necessarily out of reach for smaller or mid-sized companies as well, because one approach, of course, the most expensive would be that the company pays for the entire cost, and that's definitely a huge perk. But a variation of this is companies actually establishing this on site childcare, but then subsidizing it. So certainly it's a big commitment from a company standpoint in coordinating this. But again, if it's going to make it that much easier for your team members, make them happier team members, then offering that subsidy and coordinating, this childcare, could be a nice alternative. And then, Joey, I think there were also a handful of other things that companies can do. I know you started to mention one, and I wanted to toss out those suggestions and alternatives for our listeners as well. So, what are other things that we haven't covered so far that other companies can do to help working parents with childcare needs?
One thing that you can do is to evaluate flexible work schedules and seeing if there's anything that can be done to make your day a little bit flexible for team members so that they can respond to childcare needs while also prioritizing, their work commitment. I think about here in Maryland, we just basically shuffled the deck when it comes to start times for elementary, middle, and high schools. And so it puts parents who may have had a rhythm last year, it puts them in a different place of now having to figure out what to do because their times of their kids' needs are different. And I mean, there are teacher shortages, there are bus driver shortages all across the country, and those can have an impact on parents who may have to, even if they are at a public school where they're not necessarily paying for tuition, they still may have to do that daily pickup and drop off. So evaluating flexible work is a big one. Another thing is I got to give a shout out to a friend of mine who runs a company in Maryland called The Cube. And The Cube actually, it's a co-working space for parents. And so I think it's a really great idea if there's something like that in your area, um, or just reach out to Dr. Tamara Lucas to build one in your city. But places like that where childcare is embedded into the co-working or into the facility that you're at. Those are two that I have in mind.
Those are great. And I love that concept of the co working space. I didn't know that that existed, but it makes sense to me because most certainly, based on everything we've discussed so far, there's absolutely a need there. And just a couple a couple suggestions in terms of alternatives that I wanted to toss in before we prepare to move on to the next segment, are just a couple other things companies could do. You talked about flexible work schedules, but I also think that in addition to that flexibility, having some consistency, like having a regular work schedule, is tremendously helpful as well, so that you can plan around all of the needs for your family and your childcare. Because, there's nothing worse than having a job where, your childcare goes until 6 p.m., but your boss on a regular basis might be like, oh, hey, by the way, I need you to stay till 7. And then you're like scrambling, like who can pick them up? Like who's authorized to pick them up? All that fun stuff. But also there's this benefit that some companies provide, somewhat similar to how sick days or sick plans are administered. And the idea of it is for backup childcare assistance. And so some companies offer this as like complimentary emergency care at like a local child care provider location, right? So it's like, hey, their regular childcare isn't available. So having an option set up for them in advance is definitely beneficial. And that could either be provided like on a predetermined number of days, like sick days. And then if they exhaust those pre-authorized, like complimentary days, then additional days would be at a small fee. So, again, it's just kind of removing the complexities that, or the challenges that come with being a working parent and trying to navigate childcare needs.